During the last few weeks of protests, there have been multiple instances of violence. And if you only get your news from the mainstream media, especially if it's from Fox News, you probably believe that it's because of Antifa super soldiers that are rampaging across the country killing people. In reality, that's not really the way that it has shook out. Even in particular cases where initially violence, especially against police, were identified as being committed by leftists, very often turns out not to be the case. So I want to run you through a few instances of this. So first of all, we have an Air Force sergeant linked to an anti-government movement charged with murder and attempted murder on Tuesday in the shooting death of a federal security officer outside a courthouse in Oakland, California last month. So this is a story that developed over the course of the past few weeks with the initial shooting and then eventually a shootout with this individual when he was eventually tracked down. During that, this was on June 6th, Carrillo, the shooter, used his own blood to write Boogaloo phrases on a vehicle he allegedly carjacked while trying to flee. So, as he was in fear of dying, he began scrawling Boog and other quotes of the Boogaloo pro-Civil War movement on the car. So, when those cops were shot at, one was killed and one was nearly killed, instantly the right wing blew up with, "The protesters are killing the cops." And you could see things, like this from thought leader on the right, Charlie Kirk. He had tweeted back on June 1st, Patrick Underwood was a black federal law enforcement officer. He was killed over the weekend as a result of the riots against racial injustice, which he puts in quotation marks because he doesn't believe that racism is a real thing. Says, did his life not matter too? And then he put his little thinking face that's supposed to stand in for actual thought. Well, I noticed, so when it came out that the guy who had killed him was actually a right-winger that wants to start a civil war, and so he shot this cop to incite violence by the cops against protesters, by making them think it was a protester. Back when it initially happened, Charlie Kirk was thinking about it, but he hasn't said anything since it came out that it was actually a right-winger, which is odd. He's on to other cases that he thinks proves his point. Like, think about how cowardly, how vapid, how vacant that position is. To point this out and to specifically say, did his life not matter? Well, I guess to Charlie Kirk it did matter, very briefly, until we found out what had actually happened, and now he doesn't care anymore.
It mattered to carry his message, and then he moves on to the next one. It's just how it works. You don't actually have to care about it. You just bring up a couple of trigger words, say those things to convince yourself that you've won an argument with someone about the topic, then move on and never come back to it. So every time you hear someone say Chicago, Detroit, that you know what they're talking about, and they actually have no idea or investment in any of those cities or the reasons why the bad things that happen there are happening there. It's just a way to move on and convince themselves, I won, served those libs. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, just one other detail in that particular case, that cop killer apparently used a ghost gun, a homemade AR-15 type rifle in these shootings. So bear that in mind. That's a story that we've talked about on TYT, the fact that they are able to, in some cases, even 3D print components for these untraceable assault rifles. Seems like sort of a big deal.
Hey, all I'm saying is, I've seen the president tweet out Antifa in all capitals with exclamation points to make sure we know who he thinks is doing the violence. Is he tweeting out the Boogaloo movement stuff? Is he tweeting that out? Is he talking about how it's disastrous and what they're doing to the police officers? Because I thought he cared about police officers' lives. I thought blue lives matter.
Yeah. The thing is, I don't remember if it was on yesterday's show or if it was 2 days ago, but we got a super chat from someone saying, why aren't you talking about the cops that have been killed? And I said, look, any of this violence is terrible, but I understand that these protests draw in opportunistic, violent people. At the time, I didn't believe that it was likely that it was a right-winger that had done it, but I'm not going to use the limited time I have while this nationwide movement for substantive police reform is going on to stress something that could have just been opportunistic violence. Like, does that person now no longer care? I'm curious. Like, the right, Fox News, they were all over this thing. Do you think that they're talking about it? Like, did Tucker Carlson talk about it on his show yesterday? Like, oh my God, yeah, these right-wingers, these militia guys, they're actually killing cops in the streets right now and trying to pin it on peaceful protesters. Is that a story that they're doing? Of course it's not. It's all misinformation.
That's the whole point, is to make sure you push that thing a certain way. It's maddening. Oh, I had a really good point about this, but continue on. Sorry.
I apologize. Feel free to jump in if you think of it. I want to give you a little bit more information on another case. So this is something that I believe we talked about yesterday. So we had, at a protest in Albuquerque, protester was shot by a counter-protester, who we knew at that time was a right-winger. So 39-year-old Scott Williams was shot several times in the torso, in critical but stable condition, is still alive. Stephen Ray Baca was the individual who did the shooting. And generally, at least on TDR, we don't really show pictures of people who commit these sorts of violent acts. I don't want to glorify it or anything like that. But sometimes you do need a little bit of contextual information. So I guess we'll break that streak and we'll show you one picture of the shooter in this case. Oh, it's a picture he posted of him wearing a MAGA hat at a Trump rally. Because he's a Trump-loving militia member. That's who he is. And he put himself in a position where he could justify shooting an individual that thankfully is still alive. I've watched the video. It certainly looked like he had killed that guy. And again, so violence at the rallies. Someone was shot. Again, a right-winger. Just like in Seattle, the guy who says he's part of the KKK, it's not clear if he actually is. He tries to run down protesters, then shoots someone and walks away into the crowd. Right-winger. Why aren't they talking about this? How can you have months, or at least a month, of protest coverage focused exclusively on violence and never actually identify the people doing the violence, the right-wingers and the cops? It's all Antifa. I don't know if there's a single Antifa person at any of these protests. Certainly, no one in the DOJ, the FBI, has been able to track down a single one. But they just talk about Antifa. People are getting shot left and right. Cops are being killed by right-wingers, exactly as we said at the beginning. That they're going to infiltrate these things and they're going to try to pin acts of violence on the protesters. It is what we said at the beginning, and we've been seeing it in city after city.
They don't care, and there's the other part of it. So if you actually don't, first off, they're fans of the violence. That's what they want, because it's getting to the end point of blaming it all on protesters because that's the way they can operate. It's the only leg they can have to stand on is a false one. Number two, if you actually care about the violence, if you care about businesses being destroyed, if you care about police being harmed, the ones who aren't out there killing folks and having to go and do their job and stand out there and fight with people because they've been told to by their commanders, how about maybe the legislators, maybe people who are in charge of changing the rules, maybe police chiefs? They should say, hey, everyone, we want peace. We're going to reform this whole situation. We're going to pass real laws, not the things like what Tim Scott is leading and what Trump signed with his executive order yesterday. We're going to do something for real. We're going to listen to you, and we're going to do something differently so that the violence can stop. If you want the violence to stop, do something about it. If you don't, then don't do anything about it. So you purposely miss the point of how you can end this. You can end it really easily. Just change the way you do things and tell the people, we're going to change the way we do things. We hear you. But you can't do that. So you obviously don't want anything to end.
Yeah, that executive order. I mean, we'll see what ends up happening with the bill, but...
Bill is the same thing as the executive order.
Exactly.
Same thing.
Exactly. And one other thing I wanted to focus on, we haven't talked much about it, it was in the news yesterday, but the cops had accused Shake Shack employees of putting bleach in their shakes, and they were getting sick. There was an investigation. There was no evidence that actually happened.
But but it'll still stick.
Yeah, it'll stick. Yeah. This correction, maybe 1 in 100 people who have passed around the memes that, Antifa anarchists have been poisoning cops. No, it turned out that it didn't happen. And this is just the latest in the cops lying about violence towards them. With the concrete milkshakes, there was no evidence of that. They say this all the time. Today in the news, there's the, Officer Karen thing going around where she says that they delayed bringing out her McMuffin because she was a cop. I've waited for food at McDonald's, didn't know I was a cop until that moment. Yeah, she's worried. It's all misinformation.
She's worried because there's a large segment of the population that's very upset with police officers, and she's worried that people are going to start retaliating. I understand that paranoia, because I get paranoid sometimes about things that I just assume might be happening around me. You know what I do? I avoid those situations. So if I'm a cop and I'm worried about McDonald's poisoning my McMuffin, I'm not going to effing McDonald's. I'm bringing my own lunch, I'm packing it and putting it in the back seat. That's what I'm doing. And maybe it's a hassle, but if I'm severely worried about it, I'm not going to put myself in that situation then.
Yeah, someone in the comments said, but didn't Trump say bleach was good for you? Exactly. Oh, yeah, no, and by the way, they tried to say in San Diego that the protesters were putting bleach in leaf blowers and blowing it towards the cops. There was no evidence of that either. They just lie. Jesus.
You mean chemical warfare? Maybe like tear gas, maybe?
Yeah, exactly, that they're using. There was a news report of one protester was arrested for picking up and throwing a tear gas canister back at the cops and was charged with assault with a deadly weapon.
Oh.
It's like, what? when did it become deadly exactly? Anyway, and yeah, by the way, like, even watching The Officer Karen, like, if I see someone who's like, severely distraught, I'm, a progressive, I get sad or whatever. Let's say you are a cop who got in it for the right reasons. You're one of those kids who were, when you were 8 and someone asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? You're like, I want to be a cop. I want to help people. Let's say you're one of those people. If the anti-cop sentiment is so bad that you can't order a McDouble, maybe it's time for reform. Maybe there's something to it.
Yep. It's the way the country's always been. You ignore and you push back on reality and actual change, and then you say it's BS. Mm-hmm. That's just the way we operate. We're too good to listen to you.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.